Well, our guest speaker this morning is Jade Lewis, who is married to Tristan. They are proud parents to 3 young children and also pastors of the Generations City Church. Jade has dedicated her life to helping people of all ages, walks of life and professions to make changes to their own lives. And through her seminars and presentations, she has motivated multiple thousands of school students around Australia, educated parents and inspired business groups with her incredible story and her positive attitude to live a life of freedom and success. So we're delighted to have her with us here this morning to share her amazing story. Ladies and gentlemen, Jade Lewis.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, the Honourable Peter Quinlan. It's my absolute privilege to be chosen as this year's guest speaker. I would also like to first acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and pay my respects to elders past and present, and I would also like to thank God for this beautiful day and this gathering. I'm born and raised in Western Australia, and together with my husband Tristan, we have dedicated our lives to do what we can to make our state a better place. For 21 years, I've been speaking in schools, delivering a Just Say No to Drugs message to our young people. I've also been speaking to parents through the Under Your Influence seminar because I firmly believe that if we're going to effectively reach our young people, then we first need to reach their parents. And for 14 years, delivering a number of pre- and post-release programs in our female and youth prisons across WA. And currently I'm studying my Masters in Criminology. Together with my husband, we are also pastors of Generations City, which is a vibrant, relevant, contemporary church on Sunday, but we get to business through the week by feeding our community through a large-scale feeding program and much more. There is a quote that says, "Find something which you love to do, and you will never work another day in your life." And it's such a privilege that we get to do this. But my passion to help others is not done out of duty or a career, but out of a heart that has been touched by the grace of God. At 21 years of age, I was addicted to heroin. I was on the methadone program. I would do what I could to support my drug habit. I would steal, I would break the law, and I would do anything that I could to fund this drug use. My parents didn't know what to do with me anymore, and they used to think, well, maybe if they just ignore the problem, maybe the problem will just go away. I was in an abusive relationship, and by the time I was 21, I wasn't just addicted to drugs anymore, I'd lost hope. And when you lose hope in your life, you lose the ability to want to pick yourself back up and face one more day of your life. But I thank God every day that I found my second chance at 22. I had been charged by the police and I came to a crossroads where I had to make some serious choices for my life. And I was given the opportunity to go into a program and find my second chance. And during some of the very dark and lonely and depressing days of my personal recovery, I just remember saying this very small prayer to myself, that if I ever get my life back together, then I would give my life to help others, and I've never gone back on that. And that's the journey that I'd like to take you on this morning. But I only have you for a few short moments, so if you do want to read more about my story, you can get some copies of my books, which will be available in the foyer. My first book is called Golden Haze, and today we have this in over 850 Australian schools. And my second book is called Under Your Influence, and that is a book for parents. You know, our testimonies and our stories of faith are very powerful tools, because when we come into a room of believers like this and we start sharing about what Jesus has done in our life, the atmosphere goes from here up to here. But our stories of faith and our testimonies also show those who don't yet know Jesus that he is alive, that he is active, that he is real, he is relevant, and he is ready to help you today. I was probably reminded of my story about 14 years ago. And about the time I was married and I had 2 young daughters, and I was going about my day when the telephone rang, and it was a telephone call that was about to interrupt my life. And as I picked up the phone, on the other end of the call was a lady saying, "I'd like to speak to Jade Lewis." And I said, "Well, it's Jade Lewis here." And she said, "Well, who are you?" And I said, "Well, who are you?" And she said, "Well, I'm a volunteer at the women's prison." She said, "Some of those women have been reading your book and we're wondering, would you give up a Saturday morning and come and meet these women?" And as I watched my 2 young daughters wiping Vegemite up and down our lounge room wall, I answered very quickly and very firmly, "Thank you very much for the invitation, but no thank you." I said, "It's not a very convenient time in my life at the moment. I've got 2 young daughters. I'm newly married." I said, "But just wish those women all the best and I hope they find their second chance." I hung up the phone and then my husband came home. He was asking me about my day, and as I said to him, "The state women's prison rang here." He was like, "No way, what did they ring for?" I said, "Well, they wanted to know if I could come in and meet some women who had been reading my book." He said, "Well, what did you say?" I said, "No way, anywhere but the women's prison." And then my husband sat me down and began to challenge me, like every good husband does. And he said, "When you were like these women, those in society which were the least, the last, the lonely, the lost, the unlovable, those that not many people wanted anything to do with," he said, "remember you were once like those women. Yet somebody stopped and inconvenienced themselves for you." He said, "It's very obvious what you should be doing than to actually go and help these women by simply sharing your story." My story wasn't always about defeat. Just trying to work this. My story wasn't always about defeat. You know, growing up for me, I grew up in a family where my parents are still together, and my dad was always a big believer in sitting us girls down from a very young age, and he used to talk to us girls all the time about having a dream, about having a goal. And he would say to us girls, if there's something that you have to do, he said, find something which you love to do and try your best at it. So the thing which I used to love to do as a young girl is I used to love to run. So I used to go off to school and daydream outside the window, picturing myself standing up there on the #1 podium, taking a gold medal for my country. I learned some of life's early disciplines through my sport at a very young age. I learned that there is no such word as can't. It's don't want to. I learned that the only place that you're going to find success before work is in your dictionary. That if you want something, you're going to have to work very hard to get it. And I also learned that woulda, coulda, shoulda is simply a waste of time. So I became very focused. I joined our local athletic club, began to train on the weekdays and compete on the weekends. By the time I was 12, I won my first state medal for the 800 metres. And by the time I was 14, I was chosen to race in the WA state team going to Singapore. I was a 4, 8 and 1500 metre runner, and that year I won lots of awards for my sporting achievements. And then I turned 15. Because I kept my eye on my goal and where I was going at 15, I was chosen to race in the state team going to Malaysia. I went to Malaysia and I won a medal also. But it was probably about 15 that my life took this 180-degree turn. When I came back from Malaysia, Little Athletics had finished, which meant that I had to make a decision of would I go up to senior athletics or will I go off and try another sport? But at 15, I was starting to feel the pressure of feeling like I had to win all the time, make teams all the time, break records all the time, of juggling schoolwork and exams and assignments, that I made a decision at 15 that I wanted to give up my sport for 1 year in the hope that I could come back at 16, refreshed and refocused, and pick up from where I left off. So I gave up my sport, And as I gave up my sport, it began to highlight a major need in my life. That up until that point, a lot of my identity was based on what I did. That I never really knew who I was. And when you don't know who you are at the core of who you are, then there is a whole world out there waiting to tell you what you're not. I became very vulnerable and I began to search for life's most important questions. Who am I? And what is my purpose? And where do I belong? And unfortunately, I started to drift in all the wrong places. I started to go off to parties, drinking alcohol and smoking marijuana. And not because I was going off with the bad group, but I was going off with people who were as equally as lost as me. The Bible says that when the blind lead the blind, they both will fall into the ditch. So we were going off to parties searching for something. By the time I was 15, I started to go to rave parties, experiment with LSD and ecstasy. And just before my 16th birthday, I met my first boyfriend. He was a lot more streetwise than me. He had family who had been in and out of prison, and he'd used drugs from a very young age. It wasn't long before he came into my world and flattered me with all these empty words, and then led me into a filthy, old, dirty, run-down bathroom and pulled out a needle full of drugs and asked me if I wanted to use it. I was 15 years old when I lost my innocence to that world. In Golden Haze, I open up chapter 2 with this sentence: nobody ever forced me to take drugs. I was such a risk taker, and I was so bold to think that I could open up this doorway without consequence. I was so lured into that whole glamour and glitter and fake world of the drug scene, and nobody could tell me any different. By the time I was year 12, I lost the high school captaincy. I dropped my TEE. This boyfriend who said he loved me so much at 15 now started to hit me and push me around. So I had 2 secrets at 17, the drug use and this boyfriend and what he was doing. So I was imploding. And by the time I was 18, I became addicted to heroin. I woke up one morning and I had this epiphany. I looked around at my life and I thought, I hate my life. What am I doing? This boyfriend's driving me crazy. My parents aren't talking to me. I haven't put my sneakers back on and gone back to my sport. I thought, where are the bright lights of the rave party now? Where are all the free drugs that we were given at the beginning? Because all we do now is hurt each other and steal off each other. And I thought to myself, this is the day that I'm going to walk away and I'm never going to do drugs again. But it wasn't until the day that I woke up and I tried to stop using drugs was the day that I actually realised I became a drug addict. And so the problem now wasn't just mine, the problem was about to become my parents'. So I went home to my parents and I said, I need to talk to you. I said, I owe a lot of money, this boyfriend is beating me up. And I said, and I think I'm addicted to drugs. My mum cried for the next 7 years. My dad wanted to find all the drug dealers and this boyfriend and hurt him and break his arms and legs, and he did, and I'll tell you that story in a minute. He got all motivated and sent me off to clinics and social workers and rehabs and sent me and mum on holidays in the hope that I could just break this cycle. But it never broke, and I started to understand at 18 what failure was all about. My dad got so fed up with what was happening that my dad went out and found this guy and beat him up so badly that they returned back to my parents' house with big slabs of concrete pavement cement and threw it through their bedroom window at about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. My parents got restraining orders and police protection, and my dad said to me if I went back to these guys that I was out of his family. That I stooped so low in my addiction that I went back to the guys because I thought they had what I wanted. But it wasn't just about me, mum and dad. What about my sister? My sister, sitting there spectating what was going on, became the silent sufferer. She became so overwhelmed with what was going on. She didn't know who to reach out to, and the saddest thing in her story is she didn't know that there were people there to talk to. We have a whole room here of 1,000 people. Can we all make an agreement to be available to see past our natural eyes and look into people's eyes and ask them the question, are you okay? My sister didn't know who to talk to. She bottled it all up, and by the time she was 19, she became addicted to heroin as well. So there were two of us out there on the streets, stealing, dealing, ripping people off, doing everything we could to get drugs. I think it was about 18 is when I probably lost my voice. You know, I'd become so traumatized by what was happening around me that I didn't know, even if I sat in a seat, where do I actually begin? And when we work with broken people, I think we need to understand and see addiction and drugs and crime and violence as mere symptoms. And over the years, studies have shown us that perhaps these symptoms are caused by mental health, depression, anxiety, and other things. And while sometimes they're correct diagnosis, we have to go one step further and deal with this third level, which is unrecognized and unresolved trauma. I became so traumatized by what was going on around me, I didn't even know where to begin. And it wasn't just about me. The enemy doesn't just go after the one in the family. The enemy started with me and dragged my whole family into this mess. And can I encourage you, if you are a mum or dad or a praying person in here and you have a prodigal son or daughter, don't give up praying. Prodigals always find their way home eventually because they know their way home. At 21, my mum came out to find me and she just said, I want you to come home. We don't know what we're going to do to help you, but will you just come home? So I broke up with this guy, I moved back to my parents' house and we were in frozen mode. No one knew what to say, no one knew what to do. But it was on Mother's Day that year that the police decided that they were going to show up and eventually I was charged. Sitting in the police station, my dad said to me, don't you dare ask me for one more bit of help. He said, if you've done all of this, he said, then you're going to learn the hard way and learn to stand up and take responsibility. And even though I hated my dad for doing that to me, my dad was about to teach me the most important lesson in my life, that with every choice we make, there is a consequence. So when I stood in court shortly before my 22nd birthday, I started to have this thought, God, if you are real. You know, there is a cry in every human heart that when we hurt, we cry out to God. And in that courtroom, I was like, God, I need your help. And I started to remember 3 different people that had come across my life to help me in that course of time. And the first one was my social worker. And my social worker used to sit with me for 1 hour a week for a year. And she would always encourage me, and it wasn't until many years later that she contacted me and she began to say to me, she said, I always knew that you would make it. I said, well, you wouldn't believe it, but I am a Christian today. She said, I knew it. She said, I'm a Christian too. She said, I was never allowed to share my faith in that government environment. She said, but let me tell you, I used to gather the women at church and I used to pray for you and pray for my other clients. Here is this social worker who was not limited by her surroundings, but chose to stand on the word of God that actually says that the prayers of the righteous availeth much. She is Acts 2 at its best, to preach the gospel and not say a single word. Because our lives are sometimes the only Bible that someone reads. What does your life say to unbelievers? The second one was a co-worker. And she used to follow me down to the lunchroom and she would often say to me, can I ask you a personal question? She'd say, I just want to know, are you on drugs? And I'd be like, oh, that's a bit close. She goes, I just want to tell you my story. She said, I used to be a heroin addict. And she said, you know, I went to a church to pick up a hamper one day and there was a man up the front telling everyone about Jesus. She said, I felt so compelled to join my brother who was on the altar and say a prayer to invite Jesus into my heart. She said, my whole life changed from that point on. Addiction broke off my life. I got a new future. I go to church every Sunday and every Wednesday we gather together and we come into a connect group. We sing songs to Jesus. We read the Bible. And this week is Bring a Friend Week. Would you like to be my friend? And I answered her very quickly, no, thank you. I said, you're very strange. But However, this girl wasn't moved by my resistance, but she stood and kept on praying. And whose voice do you think that I used to hear in my head at 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning when the drug dealer's phone was switched off and I couldn't score a hit? Then this girl that said, if God could do it for me, you know he can do it for you. And the third one was a guy I caught a bus with, used to invite me to church all the time. And although I didn't go, he showed me that church was still relevant and still real for people my age. So I'm in the courtroom, and if there was a time I needed the grace of God the most, it was then. The magistrate said to me, what is wrong with you and what are you going to do about your problem? I said, I want to go to rehab. That's not the truth. No one really wants to go to rehab, but that's about the best thing I could think of. I said, I want to go to a program called Teen Challenge. It's 800 kilometres out of Perth. It's away from my parents, away from drug dealers and friends. And he said, well, good, you can go. But if we see you back up here doing all this again, there's no more chances for you. And as I left the courtroom, I had to go cold turkey detox for 2 weeks. My dad took time off work because he refused to put me into clinics where I'd always seem to meet up with the drug dealer in there. I ran around Perth with him and detoxing. It was a nightmare. Then my dad put me on an aeroplane and flew me down to this program. He didn't know that it was going to fix my life, but my dad knew there was nothing more he could do. He broke down at this airport as he handed me over shortly after my 22nd birthday. My hair was falling out, my front teeth had begun to rot, I'd weighed a lot less weight than I do now. And I was about to walk a road that was unfamiliar, because even as dysfunctional as my past was, I knew it. But I had to walk this road with my dad's feet firmly in my back. And his parting words to me was this. He said, you didn't get this drug problem overnight. And he said, and you're not going to lose it overnight. And he said, based on Teen Challenge's 86% success rate, and don't be one of the 14%. So I got in this car and I drove down this driveway and I started to remember those words when I was 8. There is no such word as can't. It's don't want to. The only place that success is found before work is in your dictionary. And I can't live with regret. Woulda, coulda, shoulda has to go. So when I arrive at this program, you know, the best thing that you can do when you're going through a crisis is find someone that's overcome what you're trying to and ask them how they did it. There were so many students there that seemed to have a peace and a joy that I didn't. And as I began to ask around what changed their life, one after the other, they told me that Jesus had changed their life. For the first 3 responses, I said thank you, but no thank you. But the fourth girl, who is my best friend today, came to me and spoke the 5 most important words a Christian can speak to another person. And those 5 most important words are, can I pray for you? And in that moment, I knew I couldn't live my Christian faith off everyone else's experience. I couldn't live off their encounters. And I couldn't sit in chapel every morning and spectate and watch what God was doing in their lives without actually taking that step and saying, God, if you've done it for them, will you do it for me? And as I laid my life down and I invited him into my heart, I thought that I was going to have to give up a lot. And that's right. I gave up unforgiveness, bitterness, shame, condemnation, guilt, regret, and the rest, and the list goes on. When I gave my heart to Jesus and invited him into my world and gave him the reins of my life, I knew that this was the only way, because sin and rebellion cannot be medicated. It cannot have methadone saturated in it. It can't have all these other things covering it. The only way that I was going to get free is actually coming to Jesus and laying my life down and saying, God, will you help me? And he responded to that cry in my heart by sending me the most beautiful peace, which surpasses all understanding. And I heard these words, everything is going to be okay. You know, you might be sitting here this morning and thinking, this is a story, but you know, this is my miracle. This is my miracle of once I was blind and now I see. Once I was lost and now I am found. Sin wrote me into the book of drugs and crime and violence, but God's grace wrote me out of it and gave me a second chance. I was baptized in water and baptized in the Spirit, and I was so excited that I began to ring home on my 10-minute phone calls. And I began to say to my parents, I am a Christian now and Jesus has forgiven me. They were very concerned and caught the first plane down to Esperance to make sure their vulnerable daughter was okay. And when they arrived at the program, they couldn't deny the change in me and the change in everyone else. And they began their own journey with the Lord themselves. And yet the greatest miracle that happened was my dad found my sister 9 months later and got her into a program in Melbourne. She's in community services today and has a beautiful son and is living a free life as well. What the enemy meant for evil, God always turns around for good. What the enemy meant by pulling me into the drug scene and dragging my whole family in, now God flipped it upside down. And as I gave my heart to the Lord, the rest of the family followed. Glory to Jesus. And I began to answer those lifelong questions. Who am I? I know I am a daughter of the King. What is my purpose? I have a plan and a purpose. And where do I belong? I belong with Jesus. But I knew that my journey out wasn't just going to be like that. And you might speak to Malcolm on table 3 down the front, who was the executive director of Teen Challenge, and he will say to you, quote unquote, she was so bad we had to put her out once, nearly twice. I had to work very hard to understand that rules and regulation in my newfound Christian faith was only going to cause me to rebel. In a world that says as long as you look good from the outside in, Jesus says, no, I want you to look good from the inside out. And that for me came into a daily presence with God, reading his word, that as he began to change my mind, he began to change my heart. And as he took out that stony heart of sin and gave me a new heart and new and right desires, he put his Spirit on me and he said, I'm going to call you to do great things with your life. You know, many of us have sight, but we don't have vision. You know, Proverbs 29:18 says, if people can't see what God is doing, they will stumble all over themselves. But when they attend to what he reveals, they are the most blessed. I had enough mentors in my life that loved me enough to speak the truth. And they said, Jade, you might not have got your Olympic dream, but you cannot sit in the seat and be a victim for the rest of your life. You have to get up and find a new dream. And as I began to inquire of the Lord, I asked him, what is it that you require of me, God? And he said, do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly. And I said, well, can I use my story, Lord, to help people? And the doors for me to speak in schools began to open. But I had to learn to overcome my biggest fear, which was the fear of public speaking. You know, people would rather die before they public speak. But learning to public speak and overcome that fear helped me to overcome many other fears. Fear of what people think, fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of success. That as I overcame my biggest fear, all these other fears were dealt with, because unless we deal with fear, it'll do one of two things. It'll drive you to control everyone and everything around you, or it will cripple you and you'll never see your dreams realised. As I began to share my message in schools, I met my beautiful husband along the way. I wrote my first book, and then I wrote my second book, and then we began to have amazing children. And I want to bring it to a close now and say, when I took that phone call, it was about this time in my life. And my husband's word is, someone inconvenienced themselves for you, it's obvious what you should do. I walked into that women's prison holding my books in fear and trepidation, not knowing what I was going to find, but a basketball gym full of women sitting there waiting. I was so scared, but God was so good because on the front row that day was one of my cousins. So in his kindness, he put someone there that I knew, and I was like, "You're kidding, I need you right now." And she's like, "Don't worry, we've got this." So I began to share my story, but it wasn't just the story that I saw. I started to see beyond that. You know, when we think about women in prison, they're some of our most marginalised women. Most of them have been sexually and or physically abused. They have low rates of education and vocational training. Many of them have come out of domestic violence. 67%, if not higher, are mothers. So what's happening to their children? And the Lord said to me, they're not just a statistic, that's a life. That is a story. That is someone's mother, that's someone's daughter, that's someone's sister. And I began to really grab hold of those words and really felt that God broke my heart for what broke his with those women. So from what was a running program, teaching them how to run, bandy up women's prison laps around their gym, I set up a not-for-profit. And as we began to set up this not-for-profit, it was really amazing because it began to grow. We began to run many programs and partner with the government, and to date we have raised over $1.5 million in funding. We've had over 1,500 enrolments through our programs. We have given away in total 3,000 Christmas gifts to female prisoners across our state, and we have created and piloted the first female mentoring program in WA that has an 89.7% success rate. God released another key to us 5 years ago, and that was our church. And now we have the opportunity to bring the girls there to train our church in discipleship and evangelism, and to follow those words in Micah 6:8, do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly. One of our graduates from the prison program began to set up a feeding program, and it's grown so big now that we have a team of people in there. The government support it, and since the beginning of this year, we have given over 3,500 meals and hampers away to those in our community. I want to close with this scripture, Ephesians 3:20. Now all glory to God who is able, through his mighty power at work within us, to accomplish infinitely more than we could ever ask or imagine. In closing, I want us to remember 3 things from this presentation. You see, I'm not sure of everyone who is in this room. I don't know how you've come in, and I don't know what battles you've been facing. But I do know this, we're all facing the same storm. We're not in the same boat. We all have our own struggles. We all have our own cross to carry. But I want you to know that God is pursuing you as much as he was pursuing me. The Bible talks more about him pursuing us than us pursuing him. And I want all of us in reflection from today to have that time with the Lord and lay our hand upon our heart and say to him, will you come into my life afresh? Will you come into my life anew? Will you come in and show me your heart like never before? I give you my life, and I ask that you would do with it what you want, and watch what he does. The second thing is this. With all these people in this room, imagine when we leave today, if every one of us did a kind act, spoke a kind word, crossed the street to that homeless person which saturates our city of Perth, and do something for them. Imagine what impact we could do today. And thirdly, as my family and I continue our journey to make WA a better place in the area of drug, crime, violence, prevention, and to raise a church who are passionate about these things, let us always ask of the Lord, what is it that you require of me? And he will always respond, do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. And if there's only one thing that you can do today is to look up to God and say thank you, then thank you is enough. And I thank God today for my family, my children, for Teen Challenge, Yellow Ribbon, everyone else, my dad who's here, he's just left. And thank you for listening to my story. Amen.